3 John chapter 1 shares common elements with the other two epistles from John. It begins and ends in a similar way to 2 John, especially when we look at verse 14 and it speaks of a meeting that is face to face. It also speaks of evil influences within the church and the influence of false prophets. But in this instance, 3 John is written to someone very specific, and the false prophet is a very specific person as well. So many of the concepts that were taken more generally in his previous writings are applied very specifically to these individuals. The first individual is Gaius, and in verse 1, John says, the elder, that's John. So, the elder unto the well-beloved Gaius, whom I love in the truth. Gaius was a member that John knew and loved, and who was known to have shown hospitality to brethren and even to strangers, as we see in verse 5. Verse 2 says, Beloved, I wish above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in health, even as thy soul prospereth. So there's a very personal communication between these two parties, which has a new flavor to it among the writings of John. For I rejoiced greatly when the brethren came and testified of the truth that is in thee, even as thou walkest in the truth. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. That too is similar to 2 John chapter 1, when John talks there about learning that, and it may even have been his children that are walking in the truth. And that's great as a standalone expression, verse 4. It can refer broadly to the children of the church or specifically to one's own children. It's a beautiful statement, and it's ever so true that you can have no greater joy than to hear from another source that your children walk in truth. And that point, I think, is not to be missed, because that is a very nice thing as a parent, to find from another source, an independent source, that your children are, on their own volition, representing themselves well and walking in the truth. He then congratulates Gaius in verses 5 through 8, saying, Beloved, thou doest faithfully whatsoever thou doest to the brethren and to strangers. He was known to have, as I mentioned before, to provide accommodations for traveling servants of God. Verse 6, which have borne witness of thy charity before the church, whom if thou bring forward on their journey after a godly sort, thou shalt do well. Because that for his name's sake they went forth, taking nothing of the Gentiles. We therefore ought to receive such, that we might be fellow helpers to the truth, says verse 8. So we ought to do as you have done, Gaius. But remember the caveat of the previous chapter in 2 John chapter 1, where extending that hospitality without using some discretion and using the spirit of discernment, that's an important qualifier to that, and something that Elder Ballard talked about in the previous chapter that we went over. Now we're going to talk about a specific character. His name is Diotrephes. He's introduced in verse 9. Diotrephes literally translates to being nourished by Jupiter. That's kind of ironic. And Jupiter is the Romanized name for the Greek god of Zeus, so it's kind of the alpha god in the Greek mythology, and it was adopted, of course, by the Romans. And so that's quite an elevating name for someone who lived in that time. My name means that I am nourished by Jupiter. It's ironic too, because he is pretending to be a faithful follower of Jesus Christ, but is stirring up trouble among the saints, and so he's drawing that strength, as his name suggests, from a worldly source, from a worldly God. So the verse says in verse 9, I wrote unto the church, but Diotrephes, who loveth to have the preeminence among them, receiveth us not. The word receiveth in this case is not in the hospitality sense, but he's not receiving, he's not being receptive to the words of John and other church leaders. And so John says, wherefore, if I come, I will remember his deeds which he doeth, prating against us with malicious words. Prating can also, it means to talk foolishly and on and on. It's like prattling in a way. It's talking in a tedious length. I suppose I might reflect that in these recordings from time to time. If brevity's the soul of wit, I certainly lack some. But in this case, Diotrephes is prating on. He's prating against us with malicious words, and not content therewith, neither doth he himself receive the brethren. So there it is again in verse 10, where in verse 9 it says, receiveth us not, and then in verse 10 that's repeated. He doesn't receive the brethren, and he forbiddeth them that would, and casteth them out of the church. So he is taking glory unto himself. He's not receiving the word of his priesthood leaders and the words of the prophet, and nor is he allowing that of others. He's discouraging other people to follow it that way. Elder Faust, President Faust, talked about this problem more generally as it exists in the church, that Diotrephes certainly is modeling here. He said, quote, there is a certain arrogance in thinking that any of us may be more spiritually intelligent, more learned, or more righteous than the councils called to preside over us. Those councils are more in tune with the Lord than any individual person they preside over. That is quite a statement. It's also useful to think about this phrase out of the 121st section of the Doctrine and Covenants that says it is the nature and disposition of almost all men. As soon as they get a little authority, as they suppose, they will immediately begin to exercise unrighteous dominion. So that's what we're seeing with Diotrephes. Nephi talks about this tendency in a slightly different way. He says in 2 Nephi 26, verse 29, he commandeth that there shall be no priestcrafts. For behold, priestcrafts are that men preach and set themselves up for a light unto the world, that they may get gain and praise of the world, but they seek not the welfare of Zion. Okay, so then verse 11, John says, Beloved, follow not that which is evil, but that which is good. He that doeth good is of God, but he that doeth evil hath not seen God. I think something interesting is happening with the language of this verse, because it's telling you that if you do evil, you have not seen God, suggesting perhaps that if you have done good, you have seen God. The verse reads as though that the reward for doing good is that you are of God, but there is this implication here, and it suggests several things, and we know that the ultimate destiny of those who do good and follow the doctrine of Christ is that they will ultimately see God. But John, being such a proponent of loving one another, and then here talking about seeing God, and then using the term face-to-face in verse 14, makes me think of that great quote by Victor Hugo out of Les Miserables, where he says, to love another person is to see the face of God. That's beautiful to me, and it's undoubtedly true in the ultimate sense, but also true in the here and now sense, that as we love another person, the Lord made it very clear in his teachings that inasmuch as we have done this unto the least of these, my brethren, ye have done it unto me. Well, there's another specific person that's addressed in this chapter before we close. His name is Demetrius. And he gets quite a commendation here from John. Verse 12, Demetrius hath good report of all men, and of the truth itself. Yea, and we also bear record, and ye know that our record is true. Demetrius in this case, there's one other Demetrius that's mentioned in the New Testament, and he was a silversmith that worshipped Diana. It's not likely that this is the same Demetrius, and Demetrius is a very common name in the Roman Empire. It may be that Diotrephes is a common name too. I may have made too much of that a moment ago, but in any case, Demetrius is not known beyond this mention. But what a report, and look at the dual nature of this good report that John gives in verse 12. It's of all men, and that's one thing, but then of the truth itself. That's high praise from John, suggesting that his life was in alignment with the truth itself. And that's a nice book-ending expression that harkens back to the very beginning of John's writings, where at the end of 1 John chapter 1, he talks about this alignment between us and between truth. And then John says, Yea, and we also bear record, and ye know that our record is true. And then he concludes in a similar way as the way that he concluded in 2 John chapter 1. Verse 13, I had many things to write, but I will not with ink and pen write unto thee. But I trust I shall shortly see thee, and we shall speak face to face. Peace be to thee, our friends salute thee, greet the friends by name. We talked a little bit about face to face in the previous chapter and how that's so deep with meaning. There's another way in which it is deep with meaning, and I think that's that John himself had such a close relationship with the Savior, even sitting with him in the upper room, as we're told. So he had a face-to-face relationship with the Savior. He understood this concept as well as anyone could have. And he affirmed that at the very beginning of his epistles in 1 John. So this creates a nice endpoint for the writings of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John.